Welcome to the info event of the High Impact Network here at the University of St. Gallen. I'm happy that quite a few people are interested in effective altruism and are taking part at this event here. First, I would like to say a few words regarding myself. My name is Massimo. I'm currently studying in the master's program of economics here at the university. And at the beginning of this semester, together with a few friends of mine, I founded this new Think chapter here at the university. As of right now, there are quite a few Think chapters around the world. Mainly, there are chapters in the United States, in particular at Ivy League schools such as, for example, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, or Berkeley. In Europe, as of right now, there are two chapters. One is at the University of Oxford, and the other one is at the Stockholm School of Economics. So therefore, we are not just the first chapter of Think here in Switzerland, but also one of the first chapters in entire Europe. I would now like to hand over to our two guest speakers who are involved in the international movement of effective altruism. One is Lucius Caviola. He's currently studying cognitive psychology at the University of Basel. And the other guest speaker is Adriano Mannino. He's currently studying philosophy at the University of Bern.
Thanks, Massimo. Yeah, thanks for inviting us to give this first talk here at this newly founded chapter in St. Gallen. The title of the talk is Effective Altruism, Impact Through Rationality. I hope that we can give you a short introduction to what effective altruism is. Effective altruism is a movement which started in Oxford quite recently and is now spreading all over the globe rapidly, and its community is growing faster and faster. So what is effective altruism, or short EA? Let's ask Wikipedia. Effective altruism is a topic in applied ethics which aims to evaluate how to best help others. Effective altruism is distinguished from traditional forms of altruism or charity by having the goal of helping as many people or animals as possible, even if doing so involves actions that are less intuitive or emotionally salient. The philosopher Peter Singer is a notable supporter of effective altruism. These two organizations, 80,000 Hours and Giving What We Can, are both closely associated with the effective altruism movement. We will come back later to these organizations. So effective altruism has two components. The first one is effectiveness, which is about instrumental rationality and achieving your goals. And the second one is altruism, which is about having a positive impact on the world. Let's start with effectiveness. Think about when you're playing a game. Let's say we're playing chess together. What simple, most general steps are going on in your head when you play a game? The first thing you need to do is you need to figure out what your goal is, because you need to know what it means to win. And as soon as you have precisely defined what your goal is, in chess, for example, it is to kill the king, then you can start thinking strategically. So every move you make, every decision you make is carefully designed so you can achieve your goal, and so you ultimately can win. And you want to do that in the most effective way as possible. You may use heuristics like don't lose your queen, for example, which is a good rule of thumb, because in many situations it's a good idea to not lose your queen, but you don't overgeneralize this rule. You always focus on the ultimate goal and you never lose focus of that one. This may sound trivial, but in fact, a lot of people, even though they're really good in applying this way of reasoning when it comes to board games or sports game, they fail to apply it when it comes to life. Because life can also be considered as a game. It's the real game, in fact. So in life, we all want to win, which means we want to achieve our goals, whatever these are, and we want to achieve them in the most effective way as possible. And the science of winning is called rationality, or more specifically, instrumental rationality. So as I said, winning is always relative to a goal. And your goal could be, for example, to be successful with your business, and you want to make a lot of money, and then you want to maximize this one. Or your goal can also be to live a happy life and have good friends and good relationships, and then you want to win with respect to that goal. Or your goal could also be to help as many people and animals as possible. So winning doesn't imply that someone else has to lose. And by definition, it pays for everyone to be rational, because we all want to be achieving our goals. Now the problem is that we aren't rational. Many people behave very irrational, which means that we are making decisions that are not goal tracking, which do not maximize expected winning. Maybe you know Daniel Kahneman. He's a Nobel Prize winner and is considered to be one of the discoverers of irrational patterns. Because cognitive psychologists and behavioral economists have discovered in the last 3 to 4 decades that there is a deviation from what the normative models of instrumental rationality would predict and how humans in reality behave. So such an irrational pattern is called a cognitive bias. I'll give you an example. Cognitive psychologists have conducted an experiment where they asked people how much they would be willing to donate to prevent migrating birds from drowning in oil ponds. They've asked 3 different questions to different groups of people. To the first group, they stated that 2,000 birds were affected. And to the second group, they said that 20,000 birds were affected. To the third group, they said that 200,000 birds were affected. Now, think for yourself what answer you would give to these 3 different questions, because the results are quite disturbing. People answered on average that they would be willing to donate between $78 and $88, which is weird because one would think if someone is interested in helping these birds, they would be willing to donate more money when more birds are affected, but it seems that people are not really taking the numbers into account. So this bias is called scope insensitivity, which occurs when the valuation of a problem is not valued with a multiplicative relationship to its size. Now we can imagine what kind of catastrophic consequences such a bias can have if we are judging about life and death and when the numbers are so high. In fact, there are hundreds of biases. I cannot go into detail, but you can check them out for yourself. If you go on Wikipedia and type in list of cognitive bias and you see a huge list. You should also consider a bias as something really bad, because a bias is like an error that is hard-coded in your brain and which is, by definition, always preventing you from systematically achieving your goals. So we should all be interested in trying to find ways to overcome biases. I think there will be a separate workshop about rationality later during the semester, but just it's good to know that the pure knowledge about these biases can help us to overcome them. For example, think about scope insensitivity bias. Now that you're aware of this bias, when you're confronted with such a similar question as the one before, you might be able to deliberately overcome it. And also there are a lot of specific techniques how to overcome biases. I urge you to check out this website, lesswrong.com, which is a community that is elaborating on such techniques. Then there are also some useful disciplines like probability theory, decision theory, game theory, logic, and economic reasonings. These are all tools that you may acquire here at economic school in St. Gallen, and which can be very useful and helpful in overcoming biases and becoming more rational when you apply them correctly. And then I can also recommend you these 2 books by Rolf Dobelli. He's a Swiss author who also studied here at HSG St. Gallen and who wrote these 2 best-selling books where he talks about 100 biases. So I can really recommend you to read these books.
Okay, thanks, Lucius. We've now heard an introduction on the first part of effective altruism, on effectiveness or instrumental rationality. And of course, the second part is altruism. Now, what is altruism? Altruism is basically about having a positive impact on the world. Here we got 2 components again. One, impact. And impact is simply the notion of world change, basically. So the world change that you cause with your decisions that wouldn't have happened otherwise. That's your impact. So it's the notion of how the world is different as a result of your decisions. Now, we're not interested in having any sort of impact, but in having positive impact as altruists. And positive impact, positive is simply what is a good consequence, what is making the world a better place, as one could put it, for the beings in it. And ideally, of course, it would make it an awesome place, not just a good place. Now, why should one be interested in those questions? I mean, one could ask, why be interested in discussing effective altruism at all? I mean, many people would say, well, you know, I don't care, I'm an egoist. To that, we may ask the following counter question in terms of rationality. Well, if you say you're an egoist, what is really your goal? I mean, if we are talking rationality, as Lucius explained, we always got to be clear on what our goal is, and then we can start thinking strategically and asking whether we are on track. If we are on track, and most effectively so, then we are being rational. If not, then not. So, if someone says, I'm an egoist, presumably that person would have just one goal, basically maximizing their own happiness, presumably. And we could then ask, well, are you on track with the decisions that you do or would hypothetically make in terms of that goal? Are your actual or potential decisions goal tracking? And one test in order to see whether someone's decisions as an alleged egoist are goal tracking would be the following hypothetical example. Would you push a button that gave you $10 and inflicted a horrible disease on a child? Now, most people, at least most non-psychopaths, I would assume, would probably not push that button. And if you don't push it, then that already seems to prove that you're not really an egoist, that egoism is not your true utility function, as it were. And we can then also ask a follow-up question. So if you wouldn't push that button that gave you $10, I mean, and those $10 would presumably contribute to your own happiness, but would inflict a disease on a child, we can ask the follow-up question, well, what if you already have? What if the status quo is that you have $10 and you could use them so as to prevent a horrible disease in a child? Now, why keep those $10 in that case? Now, in the first case, we had a framing in terms of an action. So, in terms of an action that resulted in a harmful consequence, the horrible disease in the child. And here it's about an omission. But the trade that you're making seems to be the same. I mean, basically, you are deciding between two possible future worlds. I mean, in one future world, you will have the $10 and the child will have a horrible disease. In another future world, you won't have the $10, but a child will also not have a horrible disease. So you are deciding in your brain, that decision goes on here, you are deciding between those two possible worlds. And in those terms, the decision seems to be identical. And cognitive psychologists have also discovered that still many people would make a difference, an intuitive difference between those situations, but that's probably also a bias, and it's called omission bias, because as I explained, you are really deciding in both these situations on whether one world or another world will come into existence in the future, and those are the same worlds, so it's the same trade that you're making in both cases. The philosopher and ethicist Peter Singer, and here we are following up on the omission bias, has a nice thought experiment called The Drowning Child in the Pond, and he asks us to imagine the following situation. So imagine you come by a shallow pond, and you notice that there's a child drowning in that pond, and that you're the only person around with the capacity to save that child's life. And then he asks us, would we save the child, or would we hesitate because we might ruin our expensive clothes? Say we are wearing expensive clothes and shoes, and we would have to ruin them and thus pay, say, $500 in order to save that child that was drowning in the pond. Would we do it, or would we hesitate it? Again, it seems that most people would not hesitate, even in that situation with that constraint, to save the child. And most would probably also agree that there is a pretty strong and urgent moral obligation somehow to save the child and to be ready to sacrifice $500. Now, if we accept that, and again apply rationality, logic here, the rules of logical consistency, we can ask, if we would not hesitate in that situation, that seems to show somehow that the value of a human life is much higher according to our utility function than mere $500 to ourselves. We can then ask, how is our actual decision situation with regard to the real pond out there, as it were, any different? I mean, whenever we are not spending $500 on cost-effective charity that might save a child's life or cure a disease, then aren't we being in the same decision situation? I mean, in both situations, we seem to be trading those $500 against a lot of suffering or death in a child. I mentioned the real pond out there, and the real pond out there could be extreme poverty. Some basic facts: 2.5 billion people live on less than $2, that's purchasing power parity, a day. 800 million people go to bed hungry each day. 6 million children die from easily preventable diseases, in fact, each year. And 1 billion people lack access to clean water. And this is while we are living in the richest society that has ever been created on this planet. And that's how it looks like in practice. So pretty horrible pictures. And often these diseases are quite easily preventable, as I said. For instance, trachoma, which is extremely painful and causes blindness, can be cured by a simple surgery that costs about $20. It's simple, safe, and extremely effective, but the people just lack the money. I mean, if you live on less than $2 a day, you just can't afford it. This quote here says, every time you spend money, you're casting a vote for the kind of world you want. And this, of course, is also true for every time you decide on how to use any sort of resource, especially time. I mean, do we spend our time, for instance, if we are interested in effective altruism, do we spend it on helping directly, on earning to give, to make larger donations, for instance, on figuring out what helps the most, that might be very cost effective too, or on reading a comic book, say? Now you might wonder, why is he including a comic book here? And that's the reason. Imagine, again, a hypothetical situation. Imagine a military doctor who comes across a battlefield laden with hundreds of injured soldiers in severe pain. The doctor calls for assistance, but the additional medical units will not arrive for 30 minutes. However, the doctor happens to have with him a bag of pain medicine that he can use to palliate the suffering around him. Would it be acceptable for him to treat 5 of the soldiers and then stop to read a comic book, arguing that he has produced some positive change in aggregated welfare and he needed to spend all of his effort helping others? Similarly, would we countenance his decision to spend most of his limited supply of painkiller on the mildly injured patients nearest to him, even though many of those a bit farther away are in absolute agony? I believe, says the author of that quote, I believe that the answers ought to be no, rather triage. That means giving greatest medical attention to those who can be helped the most in the least amount of time. That's of course the basic idea of cost effectiveness. Represents the ethical imperative under these circumstances. Now we might ask again, generalizing from this hypothetical example, applying some rules of logical consistency. Aren't we all, in a certain sense, doctors on battlefields all the time? Whenever we allocate resources, whenever we make decisions on how to use our personal resources. Why would it matter, for instance, that the battlefield, or more generally that a suffering field, is not right next to us if helping, that is having a real positive impact, was our actual goal if we were on the battlefield or at the site of a natural disaster. So if, when standing on the battlefield, it would be our actual goal to help people and to use the resources that we have in order to alleviate suffering, then how is our actual decision situation any different? I mean, if we have some resources that we can split between different activities, and if one activity or one decisional option would be to reduce a large amount of suffering, then aren't we in a sense, and if those opportunities iterate, that is, you know, if the battlefield doesn't stop but goes on, then aren't we in a sense in the position of that military doctor on the battlefield? And it seems that if we decide not to help when the geographical distance increases, then we have two options, rationally speaking. Either we are being extremely irrational, because if helping is our real goal, and if we now have an opportunity to do so cost effectively, and if we don't do it, then our decision is not goal tracking. And that's, as Lucius explained, the definition of irrationality, of an irrational pattern. Or positive impact is not our actual goal. And then maybe we would have to swallow the conclusion that even on the battlefield, positive impact that is really helping others wouldn't be our actual goal. I mean, remember scope and sensitivity bias. A strange situation there, because, I mean, if we analyze people's behavior, people's decisions economically, we can ask, what are they really buying? I mean, they can't really be buying birds' lives, because that doesn't make sense. Their decision doesn't make sense in those terms. I mean, they spend the same quantity of money, no matter the number of birds. So what are they buying? It seems like it must be something that stays constant, because people are always willing, you know, to just pay the same amount of money. And what remains constant? I mean, one thing that might remain constant, that's the second point on the slide here, is the subjective feel-good value, or the fuzzies, or the internal warm glow, as we might call it, that people get from allegedly helping others. So, you know, the internal warm glow that you get, you know, from saying, okay, I'd be ready to spend such and such amount of money on helping these birds, might be roughly the same. And still, people might delude themselves that they are actually helping those birds, when in fact they are just helping themselves. You know, they feel better if they can, you know, tell themselves, you know, I'm a good person, I've tried to help, and so on. But if we are effective altruists, and if our real goal, our true and actual goal, is to really help and make a difference, then of course we got to be aware of scope and sensitivity bias and apply rationality and ask, are we really helping? And does it make sense? Do our numbers make sense? How much are we willing to pay for a single bird? And then we should probably scale that, and so on. People don't seem to be doing this. So either helping isn't really their goal, not at all, or they are very irrational and not on goal track. Again, to summarize this point, why are we helping? I mean, it's certainly a good thing. I mean, if we are helping also, you know, in order to feel good ourselves, I mean, that's perfect. I mean, if we do feel good ourselves too, perfectly fine. Or if you want to get a certain social reputation, send out certain social signals, fine as well, perfectly so. But if we do it, importantly also to really help, to really make a difference with our lives and decisions, then we got to try to maximize the positive consequences of what we're doing. We got to try and have real impact, and use our resources as cost effectively as possible.
Okay, so how does it work? How can we be effectively altruistic if we know that our goal is to have a positive impact on the world, to reduce suffering and to maximize life quality of all sentient beings out there? Then as soon as we know that this is our goal, we can start to think strategically. Analogous to the chess game, where every decision we make is designed carefully to achieve our goal in the most effective way. But this game here is different, because this is serious and we cannot afford to make irrational decisions. When it's about life and death, we don't want to be ineffective. So we should really be careful about these cognitive bias I told you before. And we should always focus on the real goal. So Adriano mentioned poverty and the related horrible diseases we saw in the video. There are a lot of allegedly world improving organizations out there, charity organizations, that are fighting poverty and that have quite inexpensive interventions that could easily prevent these diseases. So donating to such charity organizations could be a good way to achieve high impact for us. But now it's important that we choose carefully to which organization we donate money to, because some charities might be much more effective than other ones. So it's not just about how much we spend, but it's how we spend it. So when we want to have a positive impact, we are really focusing on the result. So what I want to know is, how much do I get per dollar invested? How many lives can I save? And this is called cost effectiveness. To me it seems weird, because cost effectiveness comes very intuitive to all of us in everyday life. For example, if I want to go and buy a new TV set, and I've got two identical models in front of me, one of which costs $5,000 and the other $500, then it's completely clear and nobody would hesitate and buy the cheaper one. And it would be insane to go and buy the more expensive one. But for some strange reason, this way of thinking is very rarely applied when it comes to altruism or to charity organizations. Let's say we are interested in helping people that are in danger of malaria, and we've got two organizations to choose from, one of which uses a method where they distribute anti-malarial drugs, medicine, which on average will save one child with $5,000. And then we have another organization which uses a different method. They distribute insecticide-treated bed nets. And this method turns out to be much more effective, because they will save one life with just $500. So if I would have to choose now from these two organizations, it seems clear that I should give all my money to the second organization. Because if I would, for example, donate $5,000 to the first organization, yeah, I would save one life, but I would have saved 10 lives if I would have given it to the second organization. So if I just give $5,000 to the first organization, I am in a way responsible for not saving 9 more lives. So the criterion which is relevant for us is cost effectiveness, and we should always focus on this goal. But sometimes it happens that we lose track. That would be like if we were playing chess and we forget that our ultimate goal is to kill the king, and then suddenly we focus on another criteria which is irrelevant. And in the context of charity, such an example of an irrelevant criteria is overhead ratio. For some reason, many people seem to believe that low administrative costs are important for charities. But in fact, they aren't. This criteria is completely irrelevant. It is not goal tracking. I'll show you now 3 slogans which should make that obvious. 9 cents of your dollar goes directly to building cars. Only 10% of our expenses go into planning and designing them. We are using a volunteer director and no advertising, so we can spend $100% of the movie's budget on shooting expenses. It'll be a hit. More than 90% of our expended resources support our poverty-fighting projects around the world. Less than 10% of expended resources go toward administrative and fundraising costs. Now, these 3 advertisement slogans, they sound ridiculous, but the problem is that the third one this year is reality. In fact, a lot of charities are being praised just because they have low administrative costs. And for some way, people seem to believe that when it comes to the non-profit sector, low administrative costs are important. I will show you now a short video from a TED movie.
We have 2 rule books. We have one for the nonprofit sector and one for the rest of the economic world. It's an apartheid, and it discriminates against the nonprofit sector in 5 different areas, the first being compensation. So in the for-profit sector, the more value you produce, the more money you can make. But we don't like nonprofits to use money to incentivize people to produce more in social service. We have a visceral reaction to the idea that anyone would make very much money helping other people. Interesting that we don't have a visceral reaction to the notion that people would make a lot of money not helping other people. You know, you want to make $50 million selling violent video games to kids, go for it. We'll put you on the cover of Wired magazine, but you want to make $500,000 trying to cure kids of malaria, and you're considered a parasite yourself.
So this was Dan Pelota, who raised millions of dollars for AIDS research and then was bashed by media and let down by sponsors because his organization had too much overhead. But the problem is, as I said, overhead ratio, administrative cost is completely irrelevant. You could have a charity organization that has quite high administrative costs, but still is very cost effective, maybe exactly because it has a good administration. So this is just one example of what can happen if we lose track of our goal and focus on an irrelevant criteria. And what happens when we make irrational decisions. The consequences can be disastrous. So now let's come back to the relevant criterion, which is cost effectiveness. So of course there are hundreds of charity organizations out there, and it's really hard for me to decide which one is the most cost effective one. The world is extremely complex and there's a lot of uncertainty involved. So this is where science comes in, and we can rely on scientific evaluation of charity organizations. There's this organization called GiveWell, which conducts exactly what I said. So they do scientific research. They try to evaluate all charities with respect to their cost effectiveness. And then they come up with a ranking of the best charity organizations. So as you can see here on the pie chart, most charity organizations they reviewed are in fact very ineffective. Only a very small percentage are recommended by GiveWell. And these organizations are extremely cost effective. There seems to be a huge discrepancy between the cost effectiveness of charities, some of which are up to factor 1,000 more effective than other ones. So it's very important that we rely on our decision on such evaluation. And then there is another organization that is called Giving What We Can, which is located in Oxford. They are also conducting scientific research and evaluate charities. The good news is that the rankings of these two organizations, GiveWell and Giving What We Can, is very similar. So we can be quite sure that the organizations that are recommended by these two organizations are really very cost effective. I can also recommend you to check out the website of Giving What We Can. It's quite informative, and they are also very transparent with how they conduct their research. They also have got a page which is called Myth About Aid, which is also very informative. For example, an objection I hear oftentimes is that people say charities are doing more harm than good, which might be true for some organizations, but of course not for all of them. So I recommend you to read it for yourself. Then this is another organization that is extremely cost effective. It's called Deworm the World. I quote from their website. Over 600 million school-aged children are at risk of being infected with parasitic worms. These infections are chronic and widespread, harming children's health and development and limiting their participation in school. School-based deworming is universally recognized as a safe, simple and cost-effective solution. The benefits of school-based deworming are both immediate and enduring. Regular treatment can reduce school absenteeism by 25% and increase annual earnings by over 20%, and at a cost of less than 50 US cents per child per year. So by just donating 50 cents to this organization, I can deworm a child somewhere in a third world country. And by realizing that we are part of the wealthiest generation that has ever existed on this planet, for me it helps to make ethical opportunity costs more explicit by asking myself, what could I have done instead, counterfactually? For example, after this talk, I could go and buy a cup of coffee, or instead I could choose to donate these $3 to this organization. I could deworm 6 children. Now you may ask whether this is not asking for too much, but I think we can all decide for ourselves how much we are willing to donate. Many effective altruists, for example, members of Giving What We Can, they have decided to pledge, to make a pledge where they state that they are going to donate 10% of their lifelong earnings to the most effective charity organization they can find. So until now we have only talked about poverty, but one might ask whether there are other causes that are even more effective. And one possible candidate could be animal welfare, because if we are really concerned about reducing suffering and have a positive impact, then animal welfare might be an extremely high impact example. There are 60 billion animals that are slaughtered each year, and they suffer terribly in animal farms. On average, a meat consumer eats about 1,000 animals in his life. So promoting vegetarianism or veganism could have extremely high impact. And organizations such as the Humane League or Vegan Outreach are doing exactly that. So donating money to these organizations can be extremely high impact. Analysis suggests that if we donate $1 to these organizations, we'll prevent 100 days of suffering in a factory farm. Now, if we bring wild animal suffering into the picture and possible future technologies that might prevent that, the stakes might be even higher. There might also be other game-changing causes which rely on future technology. Some of these ideas may sound futuristic and even science fiction, but if we consider that technological progress is advancing faster and faster at an exponential speed, then some of these ideas may be more realistic than they sound at first glance. For example, breakthrough in vitro meat research could have an enormous impact because it would vanish the suffering of billions of animals in factory farms. And then there's this saying, don't give them fish, teach them how to fish. Well, of course, we don't want to teach people how to fish, and I've just talked about animal welfare, but the idea behind it is that instead of focusing and trying to solve all the different problems now directly, we could instead try to go one level up and try to solve the problem-solving problem itself. For example, many people believe that developments in artificial intelligence has very high priority. Imagine that we could develop a computer which is more intelligent than a human being, and then this computer could improve itself further and further. And this is what people call intelligence explosion. And then we would have a artificial intelligence which would then be able to solve all our problems which we have much more efficiently. There are other future technologies such as nanotechnology or even human enhancement which may have a similar leverage effect. So, but as I said, these ideas sound crazy. But I think as an effective altruist, we should be very open-minded and try to look at the big picture and also should consider all opportunities.
Okay, we've now heard about different causes that we might focus on under the heading of what to do as an effective altruist. One very important thing that we also have to do is try and figure out what the most important decisions are, in fact, in our lives, where the highest leverage points are. And an obvious candidate here is career choice. There's this organization, also Oxford-based, called 80,000 Hours. The name stems from the fact that each one of us is going to work professionally, in terms of the professional career, for about 80,000 hours throughout our lives. So those are lots and lots of hours. This is a lot of time that we are investing, and therefore it seems that the stakes are very high as well, in personal terms as well as in world at large terms. And that's why it should be very cost effective to reflect on that choice quite a little bit. Impact and the notion of replaceability are crucial when it comes to the ethics of career choice. In fact, I already gave you a definition of impact, and the notion of replaceability is already built into that definition, because, as I said, impact is the notion of world change that would not have happened otherwise. That is non-replaceable. And so you always got to ask, in fact, for any decision that you make with regard to whatever goal you're trying to achieve, but especially in terms of career goals, the following question, this might actually be maybe the most important take-home question of our talk. Is the world any different because of what I am doing? Or would it happen anyway? Would someone else, for instance, do it anyway? In which case, my impact is precisely zero. Or another way of framing it would be, are you making a difference? Are you actually making a difference? Or are you making something but not a difference? Because that something that you're making would have happened anyway. In that case, you are replaceable and not having an impact. And as we will see, this question of replaceability, whether you are replaceable or not with your decisions and with what you're doing, is crucial. So when we try to think about the ethics of career choice, we can come up with the following categorization that's quite useful. So one first type of career that you might go into is direct benefiting. So a direct benefiter would be a doctor, for instance, an NGO worker, a teacher, whatever. Someone working directly, interacting directly with the world, providing help directly. Another career type is moneymaker. That could be a banker, a corporate lawyer, for instance. Yet another type would be a researcher, could be in medicine, could be in economics, developmental economics, for instance, could also be in ethics, reflecting on these very questions. And the fourth type would be influencer, so you could become an activist, a campaigner, a politician, whatever. Let's first ask what the broad analysis would be of the direct benefiting career choice. So how many lives does a doctor save, for instance? We could look at the data that's available on this question, then come up with a number. I mean, suppose it's 100 lives, that are in some sense directly saved by a doctor. Maybe it could be many more if we were talking about a development world doctor. But the follow-up question that we gotta ask right away is this activity, this job, or the person doing it, replaceable or not? So what would have happened, or what would happen if the person was doing something else? And as we can see quite quickly here, for many doctors it will probably be true that they are not having a real impact, unfortunately, because if they were in a different career, someone else would probably have become a doctor and have taken that same job. And so those persons or those people would have been saved anyway. That might not be true in every case, but in many cases it seems that it will be true that as a doctor you are likely to be almost completely replaceable. And unfortunately that lowers the impact. Let's go to money making as a career choice. So how many lives could a banker save? For one thing, we could have a multiplier effect as bankers, because we'd be able to pay for many doctors, for several doctors. So that already seems to be an advantage, because in some sense we are going one level up in the impact tree, and we are able to multiply, to create more branches of direct benefiting. I mean, if we ourselves went into the direct benefit career, we would just have created one direct benefited branch. If on the other hand we try to go one level up and become moneymakers, maybe we can create many branches of direct benefiting. But here again, the follow-up question, would we be replaceable in such a career? As bankers, making a lot of money and donating a large part of it, would that kind of activity be replaceable? Well, the activity that we are doing on the job, very probably yes, as with the doctor. But, and that's a crucial point, our donations very probably would not be replaceable. Because if we were not in that job as a banker, someone else would be. And because there are only, as of now, not too many effective altruists or people taking up, of course, the movement is growing, as Lucius said, but chances are that the person that would be replacing you would not be donating as much. If you're a dedicated effective altruist, would not be donating as much to cost-effective charity as you are donating. And that's why in this career choice you would likely not be replaceable and have this multiplier effect too, which seems to be a big advantage. Let's go to influencing. How many lives can an influencer save? I mean, if the influencer is successful in motivating many moneymakers to do just that, then the influencer might be on a higher leverage point still. That could be a big advantage again, and it would also very probably be non-replaceable. So, for instance, as an influencer, you could go to a prestigious economics and business school and pack a room full of promising people, and then, well, okay, that's just very hypothetical, of course. But now you can also understand where the think icon comes from. So in a sense, that's the impact tree. And one very smart strategic tool, if you want to maximize your impact, is trying to figure out where the points of highest leverage are that will enable you to create most impact branches in the end. Well, some more questions to conclude this section on the ethics of career choice. Again, we might ask how many lives an influencer, a good influencer, can save. Or, now the shrewd moneymaker could come back and say, well, how many influencers could I buy as a banker? You know, multiplying the impact again. So there is a sort of influencer money-making regress. And if you're asking about what the optimal option for you would be in terms of career choices, then of course you'd have to consider your individual situation, your interests, your talents, your opportunities, and then of course make an individual decision applying those principles to your individual situation. I have not talked about research. Research is quite tricky. I can't go into detail on that one for reasons of time, but you might think about it on your own. There are also good articles on the 80,000 Hours website on that question. How can you have an impact as a researcher? What does impact consist in? Are you replaceable or not? It seems that probably many researchers would be replaceable, and so on. That's an interesting question to think about too. What does impact mean in research, and how likely can you have it? As a banker, of course, as a moneymaker, you might also pay for lots of research. So, you know, if you're interested, say, in future technology causes, you know, game-changing future technology, then you might also become a moneymaker and then try to put that money into relevant and probably game-changing research. That might be an effective thing to do as well. There's a very common objection to this sort of thinking about career choices, about the ethics of career choice. An ethical objection, of course. And it says, well, what if the banker or any sort of moneymaker has dirty hands somehow? What if the donations of the banker, sure, have a positive impact, but what if the banker itself is also having a negative impact with what he's doing or she's doing, for instance? There are two replies, I think, that are valid to this point. And one reply, of course, revolves around the notion of replaceability again. We've seen that if you are replaceable, so if replaceability holds, then that cancels positive impact. But the same holds for negative impact too as well. I mean, we should ask the counterfactual question, well, what would happen otherwise if that banker had gone into a different career path? Well, very probably someone else would be doing the same job. So the harms, it seems like, would happen anyway. And maybe you're even having a positive impact there as well. Because if you are an effective altruist going for a banking career, say, then you might be more concerned with ethical issues than the person that would otherwise have replaced you. And so you might even be able to reform a system with bad aspects from within. So that's the first reply. The second reply is that if it is true that as a moneymaker you are in fact supporting a system that's harmful and maybe unjust, if that is true, and if it is also true, that's an if of course, if it is also true that it has priority in terms of cost effectiveness to work on that system, to improve that system, then if we go about it strategically, if we think strategically about how to best change that system, then it seems like one very good answer to that question would be, well, we should also try and make a lot of money, and with that money we could then, for instance, support political lobbying that was trying to create a change in this system. I mean, you gotta, for instance, you gotta talk to people, you gotta persuade people, you gotta persuade political players, whoever has the power to affect this system most effectively. And in order to do this, you will need a lot of money again. So it could turn out that the most effective strategy of doing this would be precisely again to go into money making and then use the money in order to change the very system. So that's the second reply that I think is valid to that dirty hands objection. We are approaching the end of our talk, and that's why I'd like to take up the initial question again, not of what to do as an effective altruist, but of why be an effective altruist. What could motivate such a life career, say, generally? When you think about what you want to do with your life, I mean, you'll certainly soon arrive at the conclusion that, well, you know, something would be your business anyway. So you'd be pursuing some business and trying to make a difference somehow, trying to have an impact somehow. But now if something would be your business anyway, you might ask yourselves, well, why not make the whole world your business then? If something would be my business anyway, why not make the whole world my business? Isn't that a much more appealing vision? And why go for some rather petty and ultimately insignificant life business instead? You know, why go for the dollar currency as an ultimate currency and not for some awesomeness currency or suffering reduction currency instead? Another way of framing the very same question, I mean, it revolves about, probably the deepest existential question that, you know, most of us pose to ourselves at some point in life. What would we want to see written on our gravestone? I mean, would it be something like, read a comic book on the battlefield? Probably not. Maybe rather something like, dedicated her career to cost-effectively, that means hyper-rationally making the world a better place. I mean, that, I think, would be a cool gravestone to have. A further reason to be an effective altruist is because it's easy, or at least much easier than one might at first guess. There are quite a number of psychological studies that suggest that it's not just much easier, you know, to make altruistic choices and decisions, but that it might also be a good strategy for the egoist, actually. So that's a title of one interesting psychological study. It says, if money doesn't make you happy, then you're probably not spending it right. And the abstract says the relationship between money and happiness is surprisingly weak, which may stem in part from the way people spend it. Drawing on empirical research, we propose 8 principles designed to help consumers get more happiness for their money. Specifically, we suggest that consumers may, 1, buy more experiences and fewer material goods, and 2, use their money to benefit others rather than themselves. And then there are 30 principles. But altruistic spending actually might seem a very good strategy also for the pure egoist. And last but not least, it's also easy because there's a growing movement around this thing. And of course, it's always much more fun if you do something in a group, if you can exchange ideas and so on. And that's one more reason that makes it really quite easy to be an effective altruist.
So you come to college and you meet some interesting people.
So right now, I'm giving a little over 20% of my income. And in the future, I've pledged to give half of what I earn to the best places that I can find.
1 in a million, right?
I donate 10% of my income, which isn't much, but I figured why not? It sounds reasonable.
Turns out there are a lot of people like this.
I've pledged to give half of my income each year to the very best charities.
I decided to share their stories.
I personally give because I think that giving is one of the most effective ways of helping others. So, I mean, it's really amazing that it's within the power of all of us to, cure blindness and help disabled children to walk and go to school and to be able to relieve their chronic pain and malnutrition.
You know, say a person were dying in front of me and, they said, oh, you don't know how to cure them, but, just give them 50 cents and they'll live. Like we have the treatment to, help them right then and there. I'm like, well, here you go. It's so simple. Like, here's 50 cents. It's something that's on the floor. Here you go. Just take it. And it's pretty much the same thing for deworming, where it only takes about 50 cents to get the medication to help deworm someone who would have had parasites in their stomach. It's pretty intense.
It's incredible to think that, by spending $10, 20 kids somewhere across the world are suffering less because of your decision.
Saving a life is a lot better than buying a new pair of shoes.
I can't imagine anything I would rather be doing with my life.
I want to help as many people as much as I can. It's not just about doing something that shows that you're interested in some kind of cause or doing something that will just make you feel good. What really matters at the end of the day is, given the money you spent, how many people are better off because of you, and how much better off are they?
There's just a huge discrepancy, a huge difference in effectiveness between charities. So some charities spend millions to save a life, while others spend just a few $100s to save a life.
Somebody earning an average income in the U.S. Can save, 10 lives a year by writing these checks if they gave 10% of their income. And if you did that over your whole life, you could literally save over 500 lives.
I've recently decided that I wanted to make giving a central part of my life, and that I wanted to be something of a professional donor. The idea behind being a professional donor is to enter a rather lucrative career and then donate most of your income to the best charities. And so this is what I'm trying to do. It's a lot easier to give than you might think. So someone making $45,000 a year in the United States, if they gave 10% of that each year to the very best organizations, they would still be in the top 1% of the world's wage earners.
Starting to give is easy. For the past couple of years, I've been having a birthday for charity, where I simply ask my friends to donate to my favorite charity instead of giving me gifts. And I give 10% of my pre-tax income to charities that are working to eliminate world poverty in the most effective way.
I give at least 10%.
And I donate 10% of my income to the charities that I think do the most good.
And as of now, I've pledged to donate 10% of my lifelong income to global poverty.
And I'm giving 10% of my income to charity. And I'm pledging 50% of my income.
And in conclusion, this is how a medical student from Cambridge summarizes it. He says, the lifetime earnings of a UK doctor are in the top 0.1% of the planet by wealth. By giving away 10% of my lifetime earnings, I'll buy around 120,000 years of healthy life, or, on the saving babies metric, about 1,200 lives. My life is not going to be worse for giving money away. Science shows that although money doesn't make you happy, giving it to charity does. And thousands of lives would be much better. Ethically, it's a no-brainer. Cambridge grads usually earn quite a lot, so everyone reading this can do something similarly awesome. And when I thought about this situation, I really agree with the guy that it's kind of an ethical no-brainer. Because on the one hand, when I think about what's at stake for me, some money, 10%, maybe 20%, maybe even 30%, I will still be part of the richest generation that has ever lived on this planet by giving this money away. So for me, basically nothing is at stake, and maybe I'll even be happier myself by giving it away. On the other hand, what is at stake on the other hand? And I'm choosing between those situations, of course, here in my brain, in my skull. On the other hand, it seems like thousands of lives are at stake. And it's crazy when you think about it, but it seems to be literally true. I mean, you are deciding in your brain, in your skull, you are deciding on whether those people are gonna live or die. And what's at stake for you? Basically nothing, maybe even some further happiness. And when I think about it that way, about the consequences of the decisions that I am making in my brain, I agree with the guy that it's really an ethical no-brainer. Thanks for your attention.